There's a particular kind of silence that fills a house after someone dies. Not just quiet. Something heavier than that. Like the walls themselves are holding their breath, waiting to see who you're going to be now that the person who defined you is gone. My husband Gerald died on a Tuesday in October. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. The kind of timeline that doesn't give you room to prepare, to grieve properly, or to protect yourself from the people who've been circling your life like patient birds of prey. I'm Diane. I'm 61 years old. I have silver hair I stopped coloring 3 years ago. Reading glasses I'm always losing. And 23 years of my life poured into a man I loved completely and a business I helped build from the back office while everyone else took the credit. Gerald always said I was the engine. His sister Renata always said I was the luggage. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened at my kitchen table on a Thursday morning in November. I want you to understand what kind of woman I am. I am not dramatic. I don't raise my voice. I don't make scenes. I was the kind of wife who handled crises by making lists and phone calls and coffee. The kind who remembered every employee's birthday, every vendor contract renewal date, every IRS filing deadline going back 2 decades. Renata knew all of this. She just didn't think it made me dangerous. Gerald and his sister grew up poor in a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. 2 kids, single mother, the kind of childhood that either breaks you or makes you ferociously ambitious. It made Gerald generous. It made Renata hungry in a way that never quite got satisfied. When Gerald started Mercer Logistics in 1998, Renata was there from the beginning. Answering phones. Running invoices. She worked hard, I'll give her that, but by 2003, when the company had grown into something real, 12 employees, 3 regional contracts, a genuine future, Gerald had also started to see patterns in Renata's behavior that worried him. Inventory discrepancies. Vendor invoices that didn't quite add up. Small amounts, always small enough to explain away. He never confronted her directly. That was Gerald's way. He loved his sister the way you love someone who's also exhausting, completely. But from a safe distance. So instead of firing her or calling her out, he quietly restructured her role. Moved her into sales and client relations. Away from the financial side. Gave her a good salary, a title, and kept her at arm's length from the books. That's when I stepped in. I had a background in accounting. Nothing glamorous. A state university degree. A few years at a regional firm before Gerald and I got married. But I understood numbers the way some people understand music. Intuitively. Instinctively. For the next 20 years, I was the invisible infrastructure of Mercer Logistics. I handled the books. I managed payroll. I negotiated with our accountants during tax season and with our attorneys when contracts got complicated. I built the financial reporting systems that allowed us to scale from 12 employees to 67. I caught 3 separate billing fraud attempts from vendors over the years and handled every one of them quietly, professionally, and without drama. I was also watching Renata. Not obsessively. Not out of malice. But 20 years of managing the financial backbone of a growing company teaches you to notice things. Patterns. Irregularities. The kind of slow, careful, almost invisible theft that only someone with patience and access can pull off. Renata was patient. And over the years she'd accumulated more access than Gerald realized. By the time he was diagnosed, I had 3 years of documentation sitting in a password-protected folder on a cloud drive that no one knew about but me. I hadn't done anything with it yet. Gerald was still alive. I kept hoping I was wrong. I kept hoping she would stop. She didn't stop. Gerald left me everything. The house, the savings, and his 51% controlling share of Mercer Logistics. Renata held 23%. The remaining 26% was distributed among 3 long-term partners who had all already quietly told me they were ready to follow my lead. Gerald had updated his will 4 months before his diagnosis. That timing would later become relevant. Renata came to the funeral composed and dry-eyed in a way that made our employees uncomfortable. She hugged me at the graveside with both arms and whispered, "We need to talk soon, Diane. About the business." I said, "Of course. Give me a little time." She gave me exactly 11 days. She showed up on a Thursday morning at 9 a.m., which told me she'd thought about this carefully. 9 a.m. means you're awake, dressed, and not yet tired. She wanted me at my best so she could watch herself win cleanly. She was wearing a blazer I'd never seen before. New. Expensive. The kind of choice you make when you're about to take something that doesn't belong to you and you want to look the part. I made coffee. I set out cups. I sat across from her at the kitchen table where Gerald and I had eaten breakfast for 23 years. She placed a manila folder on the table between us and folded her hands on top of it with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. "I'm going to need you to sign the business over to me," she said. "Voluntarily. With a reasonable buyout figure we can agree on today." I looked at the folder. Then at her. "And if I don't want to?" She opened the folder. Inside were photographs. Printed, clear, and damning. Gerald and a woman I didn't recognize. Taken in what looked like a hotel parking garage sometime in what I estimated was 2019 based on the car model visible in the background. "Gerald had an affair," Renata said. Her voice was gentle in a way that made my skin crawl. 3 years, on and off. I kept quiet because he was my brother and I loved him. "But if you fight me on this business, I'll make sure everyone knows. His employees. His partners. The press if necessary." She paused. "Gerald's legacy means something in this community. It would be a shame to see it destroyed." I sat very still for a moment. Here's what Renata didn't know about me. I already knew about the affair. Had known for 2 years. Gerald had told me himself. Sitting in this same kitchen. Crying in a way I'd never seen him cry before. Taking full responsibility and asking me if there was any way I could forgive him. We'd spent 4 months in counseling. We'd come out the other side. It wasn't the marriage either of us expected to have, but it was the one we chose to rebuild. So Renata's photographs were not the weapon she imagined them to be. But more importantly, she didn't know about my folder. I reached across the table, picked up her photographs, looked at them calmly, and set them back down. Then I opened my laptop. "Renata," I said, "I'm going to show you something." I turned the screen toward her. On it was the confirmation email from the IRS whistleblower program. Submission date: 4 days earlier. Reference number, case ID, the works. Attached to that submission, 3 years of documented financial irregularities within Mercer Logistics, totaling approximately $234,000 in misappropriated funds. Traced with receipts, wire transfer records, and time-stamped accounting entries back to one source. Her. "I already sent it to the IRS," I said. "Both of our secrets." I smiled. "Yours just cost a lot more than mine." The color left her face the way water leaves a tub. Slowly at first. Then all at once. She stopped. Started again. "You reported me 4 days ago." I confirmed. "Before you came here. Before I knew exactly what you were planning. But I had a feeling." I picked up my coffee cup. "I've been watching you for 3 years, Renata. I've been patient. I was hoping you'd stop. But when Gerald died and you showed up at the grave talking about the business before he was even in the ground, I set the cup down gently. I made some decisions." She reached across the table and grabbed my wrist. Not hard. Desperate. "Diane. You can withdraw that report. We can work something out. A real buyout. Fair terms. I can't withdraw it," I said. IRS whistleblower submissions aren't like emails. Once they're in the system, they're in the system. I paused. I looked that up very carefully before I submitted. She let go of my wrist. I want you to understand something, I said, and my voice was steady in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it because Gerald built something real and you were slowly hollowing it out from the inside. His employees depend on that company. Their families depend on it. And you were stealing from all of them, not just from us. Renata sat back in her chair, and for the first time since she'd walked through my door, she looked exactly like what she was. Not powerful. Not strategic. Caught. What happens now? She asked. Now the IRS does what the IRS does, I said. And I'd strongly encourage you to get an attorney. A good one. I stood and picked up her folder of photographs from the table. I'll keep these, if you don't mind. Gerald and I made our peace with that chapter of our lives. You don't need them anymore. She left without her coffee. Without her folder. Without anything she'd come with except the specific, dawning knowledge of exactly how badly she'd miscalculated. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her car pull out of the driveway. Then I sat back down at the table, put my hands flat on the surface where the folder had been, and breathed. The investigation took 7 months. The IRS whistleblower program is not fast, and it is not forgiving. They came in quietly, the way federal agencies do, through document requests and interviews that felt routine until they didn't. Renata hired an attorney, a good one, as I'd suggested. It didn't change the arithmetic. $234,000 is not a rounding error. During those 7 months, I ran Mercer Logistics. Fully, visibly, and publicly for the first time in 23 years. I called a company-wide meeting 3 weeks after Renata's visit, before anything became official, and I stood up in front of 67 employees in our main warehouse and introduced myself properly. Not as Gerald's wife. Not as the woman who handled the back office. As the majority owner of Mercer Logistics, who had been managing the company's financial operations for 2 decades and who intended to continue doing exactly that. The silence in that warehouse lasted about 4 seconds. Then Marcus, our longest tenured driver, 17 years with the company, started clapping. And the rest followed. I won't pretend that wasn't one of the best moments of my life. I brought in an outside CFO to work alongside me. Not because I needed the help, but because I knew the optics of transparency mattered during a federal investigation. I commissioned a full external audit going back 5 years. I instituted new financial controls and a vendor review process that I probably should have pushed for years earlier. The company didn't just survive Gerald's death and the investigation. It steadied. Quietly, methodically, the way things steady when the person who's actually been holding them up finally steps into the light. The IRS concluded their investigation on a Tuesday in June. 8 months after Gerald died. 7 months after Renata sat in my kitchen with her folder and her blazer and her absolute certainty that I was a woman she could break. Renata paid back $180,000 as part of a settlement agreement. The IRS kept the rest as penalties. Her attorney negotiated her down to a misdemeanor charge with 3 years probation. Which, considering the alternative, I thought was generous. But that wasn't my decision to make. She was required to divest her 23% stake in Mercer Logistics as part of the settlement. I purchased it. At fair market value. Which was, at that point, considerably lower than it would have been if she hadn't spent 3 years quietly draining the company's margins. The IRS whistleblower program, I should mention, awards a percentage of collected proceeds to the person who filed the report. That amount was modest but not nothing. I put it directly into the employee profit-sharing fund that Gerald had always wanted to establish but never quite got around to formalizing. It felt right. Renata called me once, about 2 months after the settlement. I almost didn't answer. But I thought about Gerald, the way he'd loved his sister despite everything. The complicated, exhausting, irreplaceable loyalty of family, and I picked up. She didn't apologize immediately. That would have been too simple for Renata. Instead, she asked how the company was doing. Well, I said. I heard you hired a new operations director. I did. She's excellent. A pause. Long enough that I almost said something to fill it. I underestimated you. Renata said finally. I always underestimated you. Gerald used to tell me I was wrong about you and I never believed him. I thought about saying something gracious. Something that would have made Gerald proud in its generosity. But I'm 61 years old, and I've learned that honesty is more valuable than grace at this stage of life. You didn't underestimate me, Renata, I said. You saw exactly who I was and you decided it didn't matter because you thought your need was bigger than my competence. That's a different problem than underestimating someone. Another pause. Gerald was lucky, she said quietly. Yes, I agreed. He was. So was I. We didn't say much after that. But we said enough. I want to tell you something about the years I spent being invisible. Because I've had women ask me, since the story got around the way stories do in small business communities, whether I regret it. Whether I wish I'd stood up sooner. Claimed credit sooner. Fought for recognition while Gerald was still alive to see it. And my honest answer is no. Not because the invisibility was comfortable. It wasn't, always. Not because I didn't sometimes feel the specific ache of watching people look past me to credit Gerald for things I'd built. I did feel that. But because what I built during those 23 years wasn't just a company's financial infrastructure. It was knowledge. Deep, granular, institutional knowledge of every contract, every relationship, every weakness and strength in that organization. Renata thought my silence was ignorance. It was inventory. Mercer Logistics is doing fine. Better than fine, actually. We landed a new regional distribution contract in the spring, the largest single contract in the company's history. I negotiated it myself, sitting across the table from a logistics VP 20 years my junior who made the mistake of addressing most of his questions to my CFO instead of me. He corrected that error about 15 minutes into the meeting. I have Gerald's photograph on my desk. The one from our 10th anniversary trip to Asheville. Both of us windburned and laughing at something I can't remember anymore. Some days I talk to it like that's a perfectly normal thing to do. Some days I just look at it and feel the particular grief that doesn't go away. Just changes shape. I miss him. I'll always miss him. But he left me something more valuable than money or ownership percentage. He left me my own story. Finally written in my own name. And that, nobody can contest. And if you think that was the end of it, you'd almost be right. Because 3 months after the settlement closed, something arrived in my mailbox that I never expected. A letter. Handwritten. From a woman named Claire. And what Claire knew. About Gerald. About Renata. And about a decision made 15 years ago that changed all 3 of our lives. I never saw coming. Subscribe. So you don't miss what comes next.